Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this comforting expectation of absolute, like, engineering level precision.
Right. Yeah.
Like, you break your arm, you go to the hospital, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen, and the doctor just points a pen at it and says, there it is, that's the problem.
Exactly. It's binary, it's observable, and, more importantly, the problem is completely separate from the doctor making the diagnosis.
Yeah, exactly. Broken or not broken. Clean. But then you step into the world of human psychology or neurodevelopment or, trauma analysis, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just, well, it's broken.
Oh, completely. It's a mess.
Right. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is honestly incredibly murky. And when you move past standard psychology into the realm of deep existential self-inquiry, you're not just in muddy waters anymore. You're off the map entirely.
Yeah, you really are.
And the framework we're exploring in our deep dive today argues that the reason this water is so incredibly muddy is because the person trying to clear the water they are the mud itself.
It's the ultimate diagnostic paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, how do you evaluate a flawed instrument using that exact same flawed instrument?
You can't. You just can't. And that is the terrifying but also kind of exhilarating jumping off point for us today. We're taking a massive stack of source material detailing a really rigorous, uncompromising system. It's known as the Acharya-Prashant framework, or the AP framework.
And it is not messing around.
No, it's not. The premise it drops right at the outset is something that it completely upends the multi-billion-dollar self-help industry in a single sentence. It suggests that the you that is constantly seeking self-improvement, the you that is trying to be more mindful, more productive, more peaceful,
right,
that you is actually the very disease you're trying to cure.
Which is, frankly, a chilling thought. It implies that all of our frantic attempts to heal ourselves, like our therapy, our journaling, all those meditation retreats, might actually just be the sickness mutating, finding new ways to survive.
Wow, yeah.
Mutating.
And the sources we've been going through over the past few weeks, they are not light reading. They present this comprehensive, almost architectural map of the self alongside a highly specific 40-term lexicon.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is. It's a fascinating, almost violent synthesis. It begins with the foundation of classical Advaita Vedanta, but then it aggressively pulls in Western existentialism. So we're talking Heidegger, Sartre, Camus.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it deeply engages with the Buddhist analysis of suffering. Plus, it relies heavily on the direct, uncompromising inquiry traditions found in the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita.
It's a powerhouse of a text. But here's the critical disclaimer we have to establish before we go any further, because the text explicitly warns this is not abstract philosophy.
No, definitely not. This isn't something you just passively absorb while you commute or, drink your coffee, just to collect some cool spiritual vocabulary to use at parties.
Right. It's not a trivia game.
Exactly. The text calls itself a mirror to be used. It states outright that the territory must be walked by the reader. So the mission here is to completely dismantle your understanding of who you think you are, and to diagnose the root cause of every fear, every desire, and every conflict you've ever experienced.
Which means if you are listening to this right now, the goal isn't to agree or disagree theoretically. The goal is to look at the mechanics of your own mind as we speak.
Right now.
Right now. So we have to define the core subject of this entire framework. If this text is a mirror, we have to understand exactly what is standing in front of it. We have to define the enemy in this scenario, which is the ego.
The ego.
Yeah. In the Sanskrit lexicon provided, it's referred to as aham or ahankar.
Okay, let's start right there, because the very first thing the framework does is tear down our modern Western definition of what the ego actually is.
Oh, completely.
Because in standard psychology, we think of the ego as a psychological construct, right? We view it as something that develops chronologically.
Yes, the standard narrative.
Yeah, you're born a pure blank slate, and then your parents make mistakes, society conditions you, you experience various traumas, and over time, you build up an ego as a defense mechanism. Kind of like a callus forming over a blister.
That's the universally accepted narrative in our culture, yeah. But the AP framework categorically rejects that.
Really?
Oh, yeah. It states that the ego is not a psychological construct. It is a physiological fact.
Wait, physiological?
Yes. It arises with the body at birth. It arrives with evolutionary baggage tendencies, deep-seated desires, biological fears. The newborn baby brings this fundamental distortion into the world, simply by virtue of being born in a physical, finite body.
Okay, wait, let me push back on that immediately because that strips away a massive amount of modern therapeutic framing. Are we saying that you cannot blame your mother for your ego? You can't blame your middle school bully for your insecurities?
That is exactly what the framework is saying.
Wow.
I mean, the environment might shape the specific flavor or the specific neuroses of your ego, sure, but the environment did not create the ego. The fundamental, foundational condition of the ego is completely independent of your childhood.
Okay, so what is that condition then?
The text defines that condition simply as this: I exist and I am incomplete.
I exist and I am incomplete.
That is the core diagnostic criteria. That's the mud in the water. And we have to understand the mechanics of this incompleteness. It is not a wound from bad parenting. It's not a trauma that can be healed. The ego doesn't become incomplete through damage. It is incompleteness.
It is incomplete.
That's its ontological definition.
Wow.
It is a void that thinks it's a person.
A void that thinks it's a person. Oh man, that is such a wild, destabilizing concept. It completely changes the objective because you can't heal a void. You can't put a Band-Aid on empty space.
Exactly. You can't fix it.
But you know what I found so brilliant in the sources is how Acharya Prashant handles this incredibly dense, intimidating concept in his actual live sessions.
Oh, the naming.
Yes. He doesn't just rely on heavy mystical words like ahankar. He gives the ego these playful, almost ridiculous everyday names. Like he calls it Hunu or Chunulal or even Danya, which literally translates to coriander or cilantro.
Yeah, Danya.
Yeah.
Like the herb you garnish a dish with. It's a masterful pedagogical move, honestly.
Why do you think he does that?
Well, think about what happens when you use reverent, heavy terminology. The mind either gets intimidated and shuts down, or gets overly reverent and turns the ego into this dark, majestic demon that requires a heroic, epic battle to defeat.
Right, like fighting a dragon.
Exactly. But when you call the source of all your existential suffering Shunu Lal, you immediately shrink it down to size. You demystify it. You take this terrifying, bottomless void, and you reframe it as an annoying, persistent little gremlin that's just running around causing a mess.
It's like the boggart in Harry Potter. You defeat the terrifying thing by making it ridiculous.
That's a great analogy, yeah.
But we shouldn't let the playful names fool us, because the underlying mechanics of how this Junu operates are incredibly insidious, because the ego is always the subject. It is never the object.
Right.
And this leads to a mind bender in the text that I really want us to unpack. The framework says that you cannot observe your ego because the observer is the ego.
Yeah, this is where most self-inquiry just hits a brick wall, because in our everyday language, we say things like, oh, my ego really got the better of me yesterday, or I'm working hard to drop my ego.
I say that all the time.
We all do. But look at the structure of those sentences. To say my ego implies a duality. It implies that there is a pure, pristine, authentic me that is holding a dirty, loud ego in its hands, observing it from a safe distance.
Right.
The AP framework says no. That separation does not exist. The I that is uttering the sentence is the false I. You don't possess an ego like you possess a car. You are the ego.
So if I sit on a meditation cushion and I think to myself, wow, I am doing a really great job of observing my ego right now.
Yeah, that's just the ego observing a projection of itself and handing itself a gold star.
Oh, man.
It is both the claimant and the judge. It's evaluating the error using the exact same broken instrument that produced the error.
It's a perfectly closed, self-sustaining loop of delusion, which begs the question. If the ego is just this formless sense of incompleteness, this void that can't even be objectively looked at, how does it survive in the physical world? Like, how does it walk around and hold a job and get into arguments on the internet?
This brings us to the mechanics of appropriation.
Appropriation. Okay.
The text states that because the ego has no actual substance of its own, because it's fundamentally an error, it has to constantly build scaffolding.
Scaffolding.
Yeah, it borrows from the outside world to feel real. It appropriates opinions, a reputation, a name, a nationality, a career, a political affiliation, and it glues them to itself.
Right. It says, look at my bank account. Look at my intellect. Look at my incredible taste in vintage records. See? I have weight. I exist. I am real.
Exactly.
You know, the analogy that came to me while reading this section is the idea of a squatter.
Oh, okay.
Imagine the ego is a squatter that is born inside a house. It didn't build the house. The house is the physical body. But the absolute second it's born inside, it immediately starts claiming everything around it as its own identity.
Yes.
It claims the furniture, the paint job, the street address, the property value. This is my house. I am this house. But because the squatter knows, deep down in its core, that its name is not actually on the deed, it lives in a perpetual agonizing state of terror. It is constantly terrified of eviction.
That is a brilliant mechanical translation of the concept. And to map your squatter analogy onto the precise lexicon from the text, we have to introduce the concept of prakriti.
Prakriti.
Now, if you are familiar with standard Hindu philosophy, you might translate prakriti simply as nature, trees, mountains, rivers, the physical universe.
Right.
But the AP framework redefines prakriti in a much more comprehensive way. It defines prakriti as the collective name for everything you see, plus you, the seer.
Wait, the seer is included in nature.
Yes. It is the combination of the physical body, the surrounding society, the circumstances, the historical moment, and all the objects. The squatters, the house, the neighborhood, and the city are all prakriti. It's the entire field of material existence.
So the ego, the squatter, looks out at this vast field of prakriti, looks at all this available stuff, and just starts frantically grabbing pieces of it to build its scaffolding.
Exactly. And I want to pause here and speak directly to the internal monologue of the listener.
Yeah, please do.
Think about the scaffolding you are leaning on right now. Think about the specific materials you've used to construct you. Is it your role as a parent? Is it your identity as a marginalized person or a successful entrepreneur? Is it your religious belief or maybe your strict atheism?
Or even being a fan of a certain sports team.
Right, anything. If this framework is correct, and the ego is mortally terrified of losing this borrowed scaffolding, because losing it equates to a literal loss of existence, it explains everything about human reactivity.
It really does.
It explains exactly why you feel an intense biological fight-or-flight panic when someone merely insults your favorite movie or questions your career choice.
Oh, man. That makes so much sense. When someone on social media says, I think that band you love is garbage, they're not just expressing a preference about music, they are taking a sledgehammer to a foundational support beam of your ego's scaffolding.
Exactly.
And the squatter reacts as if a tiger just broke through the window.
Because to the ego, losing its identity is death.
Okay.
It doesn't differentiate between psychological death and physical death. It's the ultimate existential threat.
Okay, so if the ego is this structural squatter grabbing things from Prakriti to build its house, how does it actually do that within us? Like, it doesn't have physical hands. It has to use the body's internal tools to operate.
Right. It needs hardware.
Exactly, which means we need to look at the brain. We need to look at the distinction between the brain's natural biological functions and the ego's manipulation of them.
This is a crucial pivot. Because if the ego is going to appropriate the world, it needs an instrument of appropriation. And that instrument is the mind, which the text refers to as man. But once again, we have to completely throw away our conventional, romanticized understanding of what the mind is.
Yes, the framework strips away all the poetry from the mind. It says that in its innocent biological factory-setting state, the mind is just a machine. It's an organ. The text literally says the mind is as undramatic as a liver or a lung.
I love that phrase.
Me too. And it has two very basic, unglamorous functions, memory and intellect.
Let's break those down mechanically. Memory, in its pure state, is just an inventory. It's a biological hard drive storing data about objects you've encountered. Intellect is just the processing power required to figure out the mathematical and spatial relationships between those objects. Why? For the biological welfare and survival of the organism. That is it. The mind is not an agent. It doesn't possess free will.
Which means that thought itself, which is just the neuronal activity of this biological machine, is not the enemy.
Precisely. Thought is just neurons firing. The liver secretes bile. The mind secretes thought. There's no moral weight to it.
Okay.
But here is the tragedy of the human condition, according to this framework. The ego, our terrified squatter, commandeers the mind from the moment of birth. It hacks the system. It makes the mind its absolute slave.
How does that hacking actually manifest? Like, what does it look like?
Well, think about memory. Instead of memory just objectively storing factual data like fire burns skin or water quenches thirst, the hijacked memory begins to aggressively filter. It only stores what suits the ego's narrative.
Oh.
It remembers the exact phrasing of an insult from 10 years ago because that feeds the identity of being a victim. And the intellect. The intellect is no longer used just to secure food and shelter. It's redirected to build arguments, to construct defenses, to rationalize the ego's terrible behavior.
So the ego doesn't think. The ego rides thought. It steers it.
Exactly.
You know, the hacker analogy for this is perfect. It's exactly like a malicious hacker taking over your laptop. The hardware of your laptop is perfectly fine. The processor is innocent. But the hacker is using your processor to run a massive hidden crypto mining operation in the background that's overheating your battery, spinning your fans out of control, and just ruining your life.
That's spot on. And when we complain to our therapists or our friends about having a restless mind or an anxious mind, the framework points out that we are fundamentally misdiagnosing the problem.
Because the mind isn't anxious.
Right. A processor cannot be anxious. A liver cannot be anxious.
Oh.
It is the ego's operations running through the innocent machinery of the mind that creates the heat and the restlessness.
And the output of that hacked system, the data it spits out, is what the text defines as Ajyan, or false knowledge. And we need to go deep into Ajyan, because the text makes a very specific point. There is actually no such thing as a lack of knowledge or pure ignorance.
Right. The mind is never truly empty of data. It's constantly processing information from the senses. But because the hacker is running the show, all of that data is forcibly filtered through the ego's core foundational condition.
Right.
I exist and I am incomplete.
Right.
Therefore, any knowledge that is gathered and centered in the ego, any knowledge that serves to build the ego's scaffolding, is inherently mathematically false. That is Ajyan.
So you could have 3 PhDs, you could have memorized the entire encyclopedia, but if you are using those facts to inflate your identity as a brilliant intellectual, that knowledge is structurally false. It is ignorant.
Exactly, because it's rooted in the central illusion, which ties perfectly into the framework's concept of Maya.
Maya. Now, Maya is a term we hear all the time in spiritual circles. Usually it's pitched as this Matrix-style concept where the physical world literally isn't real, like the table in front of me is a hologram or an illusion.
Right, the simulation theory angle.
Yeah. But the AP framework has a much more grounded, brutal, and frankly more terrifying definition of Maya. It defines Maya as anything that we become completely 100% certain about, only to find later that it has changed or disappeared.
It is the illusion of permanence in a universe composed entirely of passing, decaying objects. Think about the things we anchor our certainty to. This marriage will last forever. This career will fulfill me. I will always be healthy.
Right.
The ego demands certainty to feel secure in its existence.
Yeah.
But Prakriti nature is constantly in flux. So the ego is constantly shocked and traumatized when the things it was certain about inevitably shift.
And what does the text say is the ultimate Maya? Believing oneself to be special.
Yes, because what could be more certain to the ego than its own unique, indispensable specialness, and what is more easily violently shattered by the indifferent reality of the universe?
Oh, that's heavy. Okay, so if Ajyan is this corrupt hacked data, this false knowledge, then the antidote has to be Atmajnana, which translates to self-knowledge. But again, the framework flips our modern expectations upside down. Atma means I, so Atmajnana means knowledge of the I. But the notes emphasize heavily that this does not mean knowing God. It does not mean seeing a bright, warm light or discovering your eternal, majestic soul.
No, it's infinitely more gritty and uncomfortable than that. Atmajnana means developing a clear, piercing, real-time insight into who is actually behind your actions.
Catching the hacker.
Exactly. It's catching the hacker in the act, in the middle of your daily life. It is the profound, humiliating realization that you are not a majestic, free-willed, independent soul making rational choices. You are merely a predictable bundle of evolutionary traits, biological tendencies, and egoic scaffolding reacting to stimuli.
I have to pause here and push back.
Go for it.
I have to advocate for the listener who has spent years in meditation or therapy trying to free their mind. We hear that phrase everywhere. Free your mind.
Oh, yeah. Constantly.
But the text explicitly states that liberation of the mind is a misnomer. If the mind is just an innocent liver and thought is just neurons firing, why are we trying to free it? And if we shouldn't try to free it, what are we supposed to do with it?
It's a totally valid frustration, and it goes right back to the hacker analogy. You don't need to liberate the computer processor. The processor doesn't care if it's running a video game or a crypto mining virus. It just processes.
Right.
Liberation is needed for the ego. The ego needs to be dissolved. The absolute most we can do regarding the mind is to liberate the mind from the ego's tyrannical grip.
So what does a mind look like when the hacker is removed? Do we just turn into zombies? Do we stop thinking entirely?
Not at all. The framework explains that when the mind is liberated from the ego, thought reverts to its natural state. Simple functional intelligence. It is the brain processing reality exactly as it is, without a false center constantly demanding that reality bend to serve its self-centered narrative.
Okay, so you still function.
You still plan for tomorrow. You still remember your password. You still do your job. But you do it cleanly. You do it without Chunu Lal sitting on your shoulder constantly screaming, "But what does this mean for me? How does this affect my scaffolding?"
So the friction just disappears.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've mapped how the ego hacks the brain to rewrite our memories and hijack our intellect. But the brain is just one organ. What happens when that hacker gets access to the rest of the nervous system? Because, when my boss yells at me or when I get dumped, I don't just think about it.
Right. You feel it.
Yeah, my chest physically tightens, my stomach drops. The ego weaponizes the body itself.
And this is where the AP framework becomes intensely practical and immediately applicable to daily life. It draws a very hard, absolute, non-negotiable line between feelings and emotions.
Feelings and emotions.
Yes. In everyday English, we use those two words completely interchangeably. We say, "I feel sad," or "I am experiencing the emotion of sadness." But in this lexicon, confusing feelings and emotions is fatal to self-inquiry.
Okay, let's separate them. Because the text defines feelings as purely physical, biological phenomena, a tightening in your chest, a sudden flush of heat in your cheeks, a drop in your gut. They're biological responses to external stimuli.
Right.
And the text offers this beautiful, calming metaphor. It says, feelings pass like weather through a valley. They require absolutely zero management. You do not need to process them, analyze them, or heal them. You just leave them alone.
Exactly. Look at a wild animal. Let's say a deer is grazing in a field, and it hears a twig snap in the woods.
Yeah.
Instantly, its heart rate spikes. Adrenaline floods its bloodstream. Its muscles tense for flight. That is a feeling. It's a massive physical, biological event.
Right, survival instinct.
But then the deer looks up and realizes it was just a squirrel that snapped the twig. What happens? The heart rate slows down, the adrenaline is metabolized, and the deer literally goes back to eating grass. The weather passed through the valley.
But humans, we do not go back to eating grass.
We do not. Because we have the squatter in the house. The ego takes that pure, raw, physical feeling and it violently appropriates it. It converts the biological feeling into an emotion.
How? Mechanically, what is it doing?
It wraps the physical sensation in a psychological narrative and charges it with identity. The flush of heat in your face is no longer allowed to just be a biological change in temperature that will dissipate in 90 seconds.
Right.
The ego grabs it and says, "That heat is my profound outrage. How dare they speak to me like that? I am a victim of disrespect." The tightening in the chest isn't just a physical contraction. It becomes my unbearable, unique heartbreak that defines my tragic life.
It turns biology into a tragedy starring itself.
Yes. The ego takes the raw material of the body and uses it to manufacture an identity. And we can see this exact same dynamic in the difference between caution and fear.
Oh, let's break that down because I think this distinction could change someone's life today. Caution is biological. You're driving down the highway, a car suddenly swerves into your lane, and you instantly slam on the brakes. Your heart is pounding out of your chest. That is caution.
Right.
It's the egoless biological response of the physical system keeping the organism alive. But the moment the threat passes, the caution evaporates.
Fear, on the other hand, is entirely egoic.
Yeah.
It is always the ego scrambling to protect its psychological scaffolding.
Yeah.
Let's say you're sitting on your couch on a Sunday afternoon, perfectly safe, and your boss sends you a Slack message that just says, "We need to talk first thing on Monday morning."
Oh, the worst text to get.
Right. Your heart pounds. You feel that exact same tightening in your chest. But your life is not in physical danger. There's no car swerving into your lane. The biological alarm is sounding because the ego perceives a threat to its identity. I might lose my job. I might lose my status. I might be seen as incompetent. My scaffolding is going to collapse.
So caution responds to what is actually happening in the physical present. Fear responds to what might happen to me in the psychological future.
Precisely. And this leads us to perhaps one of the most profound, deeply actionable distinctions in the entire framework.
Yeah.
The mechanical difference between pain and suffering.
Yes. The text states that pain is physical. It's body level. You stub your toe, it hurts. You tear a muscle, it hurts. You get an infection, it hurts. But suffering is entirely a manufactured product of the ego. Suffering is what the squatter builds out of the raw material of pain.
This aligns beautifully with the Buddhist concept of the second arrow.
Oh, yeah. Explain that.
So the first area is the physical pain. It strikes you and it hurts. You cannot avoid the first arrow as long as you inhabit a physical nervous system. But the second arrow is the one you deliberately fire into your own chest.
Wow.
The second arrow is the resistance. It's the narrative. Why is this happening to me? I don't deserve this. My body is betraying me. I can't handle this. That psychological resistance is suffering. And the AP framework points out that suffering isn't just a mistake. It's the ego's deliberate mechanism for keeping itself relevant and centered.
Think about what this means for you listening right now. If you're dealing with chronic anxiety, or the sting of a recent breakup, or a surge of anger, notice the physical sensation in your body right now. Notice the contraction in your gut or the shallow breathing.
Yeah, feel it.
The framework is suggesting, no, it is guaranteeing that if you can manage to drop the story of why this is happening to me, if you can strip away the narrative of the victim, the physical sensation will literally just process itself and pass like weather through a valley. It only lingers because you keep feeding it the story.
It is an incredible proposition. And if we extrapolate this logic, we have to confront how the framework radically redefines the concept of hurt. In modern therapy culture, we say things like, I am carrying so much hurt from my past, I need to heal my past. But the framework ruthlessly points out a simple law of physics. The past does not exist.
It doesn't.
It has absolutely no material reality. It's gone.
Yeah.
So if you're feeling hurt right now, where is it coming from?
It has to be coming from the ego actively manufacturing it in the present moment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The ego has to actively, continuously manufacture the hurt right now, in the present, because hurt is the ego's life stuff.
Yeah.
It is the fuel it uses to prove to itself that it exists. I am the one who was wronged. I am the survivor. I am the victim. If you drop the hurt, if you drop the grievance, who are you?
The ego disappears.
The ego would literally rather suffer than not exist.
The ego would rather suffer than not exist. That is a devastating realization. Which brings us to what I think is the most mind-bending paradox, the biggest twist of this entire deep dive.
I know exactly where you're going.
If the ego is this miserable squatter, constantly suffering, constantly manufacturing hurt, constantly terrified of the future, what is driving it forward? Why does it keep seeking? Why doesn't the system just collapse under its own misery and give up?
The framework's answer to this question is its most counterintuitive, beautiful proposition. To explain why the ego keeps moving, it completely redefines the word love, or prem in Sanskrit.
We usually think of love as a positive emotion or a virtue or like a romantic bond between two people, but the text says love is not an emotion. Love is built into the ego's very constitutional physics. It says the ego inherently deeply dislikes its own falseness, and this fundamental self-dislike is what drives all human seeking.
This requires a major structural shift in perspective. Think about the squatter. Deep down, the squatter knows it doesn't own the house. It knows it's a fraud. It feels the agonizing ache of its own incompleteness. And because it feels incomplete, it's constantly, desperately reaching out for completion. It is attracted to truth. It's attracted to its own dissolution, because only in dissolution will the exhausting ache of incompleteness finally stop. That gravitational pull toward truth, that desperate yearning for the end of the false self, the framework calls love.
Wait, so love is not romance. Love is the ego's desperate biological urge to end its own falseness.
Yes, the ego is a born lover. Its restlessness is its love. It cannot sit still because it's in love with the truth. And when that love is aimed directly at the truth, it leads to liberation. But what happens 99.9% of the time?
We get distracted.
The ego takes that profound cosmic existential yearning for truth, and it aims it at the finite world of objects. It aims it at Prakriti.
And when love is misdirected toward finite objects, the framework calls it kamna, or desire.
Exactly. Desire is just love with the wrong address.
The text has this raw, almost brutal example that I cannot stop thinking about. It says, the desperate man reaching for a body at 2 a.m. and the seeker reaching for truth in the same dark hour are powered by the identical engine.
The identical engine.
The exact same engine. The direction is different, but the fuel is identical. The person lying in bed, swiping endlessly on Tinder at 2 a.m. is fundamentally looking for God. They're looking for absolute truth. They're looking for the end of their separation, but they're aiming that massive cosmic desperation at a pixelated image on a screen, hoping that another flawed, incomplete human being will finally silence the void.
It is a profound, compassionate leveling of all human behavior. It means that every addiction, every obsessive corporate ambition, every desperate grab for money or sex or power is at its absolute core a distorted cry for liberation.
Wow.
It's the ego trying to find an object large enough to fill its infinite void. But mathematically, no finite object can fill an infinite void. So the dopamine hit lasts for an hour or a week, and then the ache returns.
Which brings us to the crucial difference between loneliness and aloneness. Because the Tinder swiper is acting out of loneliness.
Yes, loneliness is inherently dualistic. It requires 2 points of reference. I am here, the object I desire is over there, and I do not have it. The ache of loneliness is the perceived gap between the ego and the object. Only the ego can be lonely, because only the ego lives in a state of separation.
The loneness.
Aloneness is non-dual. It's not about being physically isolated in a cabin in the woods. You can be alone in a crowded subway. Aloneness is the momentary absolute absence of the craving subject entirely. It's when the I that wants something momentarily dissolves. One end of the duality is gone, so there is no gap, there's no distance, there's no ache, there's just complete presence.
Okay, wait. I want to make sure I'm tracing the mechanics here correctly. So the ego is driven by love, which is essentially the ego desperately seeking its own end, like a moth drawn to a flame. But it gets confused and it keeps getting distracted by desires. It bounces from a new car to a new partner to a new job, trying to find completion but never finding it. What happens mechanically when it bounces like that?
That bouncing, that continuous friction between the craving subject and the disappointing object, that is what creates the phenomenon of time.
Boom. Time is not an external reality.
No. In this framework, time is not a physical river flowing through the universe. Time is simply the ego's dialectical, restless engagement with objects.
Explain that.
Think about the life cycle of a desire. The ego wants a new car. It thinks, when I get this car, I will finally be complete. It exists in a state of anticipation. That's the future. It gets the car. For a split second, the desire stops, and there's a flash of satisfaction. But then the ego realizes it's still fundamentally incomplete. The friction of that disappointment changes the ego. The slightly changed ego now wants a new house. It moves its focus to the next object. That restless psychological movement from one unsatisfying object to the next is time. Without the ego's movement, psychological time ceases to exist.
This is so trippy, but when you look at your own experience, it makes perfect sense. When you're deeply immersed in something, playing an instrument, writing, playing a sport, when the ego momentarily drops away, what we call a flow state, you look up and say, where did the time go? 3 hours just vanished. The time literally disappeared because the ego's friction disappeared.
Exactly. Time is just the measurement of the ego's distance from truth. And if we connect this to the overarching philosophy, it brings us to a really beautiful concept called prarabdha, which translates roughly to destiny or fate.
Destiny.
But we have to be careful, not in the fatalistic pre-written script sense. The text states that freedom is your true fundamental nature. Because the ego's engine is love, and love inevitably seeks truth, your ultimate trajectory is mathematically guaranteed. You will remain restless until you are free. Your entire movement, no matter how confused, no matter how addicted or misdirected, is a gravitational movement toward that end.
So it's like gravity. You might bounce off a million different objects. You might take incredibly painful decade-long detours through addiction, toxic relationships, or obsessive ambition, but you are always inevitably falling toward the center.
Yes. The only variable is how long you take to get there. The only variable is how much unnecessary suffering you want to endure, how many times you want to fire the second arrow into your chest before you realize the finite objects aren't working. That path of friction is your prarabdha.
Okay, so if our destiny is freedom and our driving force is this engine of love-seeking dissolution, how does this dissolution actually happen? Let's get into the practical reality of it. Do we just meditate in a cave for 30 years until we hit a permanent state of enlightenment and then we just float around like glowing, peaceful orbs for the rest of our lives?
And this is where the AP framework breaks the hearts of a lot of spiritual seekers who are looking for an easy out or a finish line. Because it states unequivocally, mukti, liberation, dissolution. These are not permanent states.
Wait, what? There is no permanent enlightenment, all this work, and there's no finish line.
Think back to the very first foundational point we made. The ego is a physiological fact. It arises with the body. It is tied to the biological imperatives of the organism. Therefore, logically, as long as the physical body is breathing, digesting, and interacting with the world, the biological mechanism that generates the ego is still running. You cannot permanently, totally kill the ego without physically killing the body.
So what is dissolution then? If we can't kill it, what are we doing?
It is a continuous, exhausting, moment-to-moment process of collapse and resurrection. The ego looks in the mirror of truth, whether through inquiry or reading or just honest observation. It sees its own falseness and it collapses. In that exact moment, you are free. You experience aloneness.
Okay.
But then, 10 minutes later, biological hunger arises, or an annoying email comes in from your boss, or someone insults your scaffolding, and the ego resurrects. It reforms. It comes back.
The squatter tries to move back into the house.
Yes, but, and this is the crucial variable in practice, if you are actively engaging in honest self-inquiry, every single time the ego resurrects, it is a little bit thinner. It is a little bit weaker. Its conviction is shaken. It knows it has been seen.
The text describes it as this relentless cycle, momentary disappearance, followed by a weakened revival. Then the hunger of love returns. Honest effort is applied. A deeper disappearance. And an even thinner return.
It is a continuous war. And the text is ruthless about this.
Yeah.
There are no stages of purification where you get a certificate and say, I am now a level 5 enlightened being. I am better than the unenlightened masses.
Right, because that is just the ego upgrading its scaffolding. The ego loves the idea of spiritual progress because it gives it a shiny new identity. I am a spiritual, detached person.
Exactly. The framework says no to all of that. The war is daily. The tendency to return to old, reactive patterns diminishes over time, yes, but it never reaches absolute zero while you are biologically alive.
It sounds exhausting. If I'm being honest, it sounds like a grind.
It is.
But the text introduces a counterweight to this continuous war, and it calls it joy. But again, we have to throw away our cultural definition. Joy is not peace. It's not sitting calmly by a lake, feeling relaxed. The text describes joy as active, explosive, and celebratory. It calls it the ego's party at its own funeral.
That is easily one of the most striking phrases in the entire lexicon. The ego's party at its own funeral. When the ego truly sees its own needlessness, when it realizes all its terrified scrambling, all its fear of eviction, all its scaffolding was for absolutely nothing. The relief is so immense. The structural collapse is so total. It is experienced as a massive explosion of joy. It's the last experience of the experiencer before it completely dissolves into absence.
And here is the grim but incredibly urgent reality check from the framework. When we talk about death in our culture, we often think of death as the final release, right? The ultimate peace. They are finally at rest. But the text says no. Death is the dismantling of the physical body, and therefore it is the dismantling of the ego, yes. But it is not liberation.
No, it's simply unconscious cessation. Someone pulled the plug on the machine.
Right. It permanently closes the window for joy. Because joy is the potential of life. You need the contrast. You need the conscious, living ego to realize its own falseness in order to experience that explosion of joy. When you are dead, the machine is just unplugged. There is no realization.
Which reframes the entire purpose of being alive. It makes every single living breath incredibly urgent. Not because death is a scary monster coming to get you, but because death ends the only opportunity the ego ever had to consciously see through itself. Physical life is the only arena where the continuous war can be fought and where joy can be experienced.
And this connects to how the framework ultimately defines completeness. If we're fighting this continuous war, what are we actually trying to achieve? We always think of completeness as finding something, finding a hidden treasure, uncovering your inner light, filling the hole in your heart with love. But the framework deals purely, strictly in absences.
This is a vital philosophical departure from almost everything else out there. Completeness is not a positive state of inner fullness. You are never full. Completeness is simply the absence of the one who is crying about being incomplete.
I have to pause on that because that is the whole ballgame. Completeness is the absence of the one who is crying about being incomplete. It's like if you have a sharp rock in your shoe, comfort isn't adding a soft, expensive cushion to the shoe to go over the rock. Comfort is simply taking the rock out. The sheer absence of the rock is the comfort.
Exactly. There's no inner light to be discovered. There's no deeper, truer, majestic self waiting behind the ego. The ego is the surface, and there's nothing behind it. When the ego dissolves, what remains is not a soul. What remains is absence. Clean, clear, unburdened absence.
Okay, having laid out this rigorous, almost violent process of self-seeing, it becomes glaringly obvious that this framework sharply clashes with almost everything we're taught in popular spiritual and psychological culture. It takes a sledgehammer to a lot of sacred cows.
It is a profoundly disruptive text. It explicitly outlines how it departs from other major traditions. Let's start with classical Advaita Vedanta, which is its closest philosophical cousin. Classical Advaita posits that behind the illusion of the physical world, there is a non-dual reality called Brahman, a pure consciousness, or a silent witness that is eternally watching everything.
But the AP framework rejects the idea of pure consciousness.
Categorically, it argues that consciousness is inherently mechanically dualistic. You cannot have consciousness without an ego at one end and an object being perceived at the other. It's a relationship.
Right.
Therefore, if the ego dissolves, consciousness ceases. There's no residual witness hanging out in the background taking notes on your enlightenment. When the lights go out, the lights go out.
Then there's Neo-Dada. This is the stuff you see all over Instagram and YouTube, the "you are already enlightened, there's nothing to do, just realize you are the universe, man" crowd.
The framework treats Neo-Dada as a highly dangerous spiritual bypass. Neo-Dada tells the ego exactly what it desperately wants to hear. You don't have to do any work. But the AP framework insists that while the ego is fundamentally an error, it is real as an error, and it has real devastating material consequences in Prakriti.
Yeah, it hurts people.
It ruins lives, it destroys relationships, it starts actual wars. You cannot just wave a magic wand, sit on a cushion, and say it's all an illusion. It requires that continuous, active, daily war we just talked about.
It also departs from Buddhism. It shares the Buddhist diagnosis of suffering dukkha, but it rejects the staged paths of purification, the Magga. And it insists the ego is physiological, not just a bundle of conditioned responses that you can slowly meditate away over lifetimes.
But perhaps the most impactful, abrasive departure for the modern listener is its absolute stance against self-help and therapeutic culture.
Oh, this is the one that really demands pushback. Because self-help is the dominant religion of our time, and it's based entirely on the premise that you have a healthy, authentic self underneath all your trauma and dysfunction, and you just need to coach it or heal it or love yourself into better performance. What does the framework say to the person doing their morning affirmations in the mirror?
The framework says the self is the dysfunction. You cannot heal the disease by giving the disease a bubble bath and telling it affirmations. Building confidence or finding your authentic self are just the ego's operations. The ego is simply upgrading its scaffolding from insecure victim to confident boss, while the corrupt, terrified structure underneath remains completely untouched.
Wait, hold on. Are we really saying that a surgeon who is confident in her ability to save a life is operating out of fear? That feels incredibly reductive. How does the framework justify throwing healthy self-esteem in the exact same bucket as pathological narcissism?
Because mechanically, they rely on the same structure. The text literally says confidence is just fear in fair weather.
Confidence is just fear in fair weather. Wow.
Think about the mechanics of confidence. Confidence depends entirely on external circumstances. Prakriti aligning with the ego's desires. If you are confident because you have $1 million, a great jawline, and a successful career, what happens when the market crashes, you get old, and you get fired?
The confidence is gone.
The confidence instantly, violently turns back into fear. There are two sides of the exact same coin. True liberation isn't being confident. It's being entirely free of the need to measure yourself against circumstances at all. So all those Find Your Authentic Self seminars are just the ego putting on a new, socially acceptable costume to avoid looking in the mirror.
That is an uncompromising diagnosis. So we've diagnosed the disease, we've dismantled the false cures of self-help and toxic positivity. We've established that the path is a continuous daily war of catching the ego in the act. But we still have to live in the physical world. We have to go to work, we have relationships, we raise kids, we have sex. How does an honest ego, an ego that is actively trying to see itself, actually navigate daily human existence?
The text provides a map for this, starting with the concept of right action, or Nikama Karma. Normally, we think of right action as a strict moral code. Don't lie, don't steal, be nice. But here, right action has nothing to do with societal morals. It is defined internally. Right action is action taken by an honest ego that consciously chooses self-seeing over self-preservation in the moment.
It's the ego actively tending toward non-ego. It's making the choice, right when you're triggered, to not defend your scaffolding. And how does that apply to our relationships? How do we interact with other humans who are also running around with their own terrified squatters?
The framework defines genuine relating in a way that is profoundly beautiful, but also terrifying for the ego. It says genuine relationship is relating to the other person with the honest intent to dissolve and be dissolved.
I wrote this quote down from our notes because it gave me goosebumps. Your presence makes my falseness unbearable, and I choose to stay.
That is the absolute antithesis of the modern relationship ideal of I complete you. Genuine relating isn't about finding someone who props up your ego, who tells you how great you are, who agrees with all your scaffolding. To use your analogy, genuine relating isn't inviting another squatter over to compliment your stolen furniture.
Right.
It's finding someone whose mere presence acts as a ruthless mirror, pointing out that your name isn't on the deed, exposing your incompleteness. And instead of running away or attacking them, you choose to stay in the fire.
This connects directly to the difference between compassion and mercy. We think of them as the exact same thing, but the text splits them violently. Mercy, it says, is validating the sufferer. It reduces suffering in the short term, but leaves the ego, completely intact. Oh, you poor thing, your boss really is out to get you. You are totally right to be angry. That's mercy. It feels nice, but it's a counterfeit. It's actually a disservice.
Compassion, on the other hand, is fierce. Compassion sees the sufferer as unreal. It refuses to leave the other person in the comfort of their fiction. If a friend comes to you drowning in self-pity, compassion is refusing to validate the self-pity. But, and this is a massive critical caveat, the text explicitly says you cannot have compassion if you haven't seen through your own ego first.
Right.
If you try to be fierce and tear down someone's scaffolding without deep self-knowledge, you aren't being compassionate. You're just being an arrogant jerk.
You're just your ego attacking their ego to feel superior.
Precisely. Seeing through your own ego is seeing through the others. They are the exact same act.
Let's talk about some of the more practical bodily aspects of life. Sexuality, for instance. A lot of spiritual traditions either deeply demonize sex or they try to make it overly sacred and mystical. The AP framework is incredibly pragmatic here. It says sex is neither holy nor unholy. It's literally just a biological bodily function.
The physical act isn't the problem. The psychological actor is the problem. If the ego is running the show, sex becomes a massive, heavy project of self-confirmation. It becomes about conquering or feeling desired or proving your worth to fill the void. It becomes heavy with existential weight.
But if the ego is honest?
If the ego is honest, sex is just a simple physical act of the body, like eating or sleeping. And the text offers a very practical piece of advice. If you must act from the ego, which you will, because you are alive, choose a partner whose presence dissolves the ego rather than inflates it.
What about parenting? If the ego is physiological and arises at birth, parents can't prevent their kids from developing an ego. You can't raise a perfectly enlightened baby.
No, you cannot. You cannot save your children from the condition of being born. But honest parents can act as the earliest, safest mirrors for the child. If the parents are willing to openly look at their own falseness, if they model that ruthless honesty, they provide the child with the tools to eventually engage in their own continuous war of self-seeing when they come of age.
Which requires an external force. It requires a teacher. But the method here is not sitting in a circle singing songs and feeling good. The method is described as ruthless, intimate violence, the ego catching itself in the act. And the external teacher, whether it's a living person, a book, or an audio deep dive like this one, is just a mirror. The real teacher, what the text calls adhyatma, is your own internal honesty, your own desperate need to outgrow yourself.
The external teacher's only job is to show the ego to itself, to point out the mud. And then the ego has a choice. It can keep the mirror, or it can break the mirror. Most of the time, because it is terrified, we choose to break the mirror. We attack the teacher, we close the book, we unsubscribe, we change the subject.
And what do we change the subject to? Entertainment. I want to pull this definition out because it convicted me to my absolute core. The text says entertainment is not harmless leisure. It is the ego's mechanism for avoiding silence. Because in silence, the ego's incompleteness is deafeningly exposed. The quote from the text: "Scrolling is not laziness, it is flight."
When you pick up your phone to endlessly scroll social media, you aren't just relaxing after a long day. Mechanically, you are actively fleeing from the terror of your own void. You are giving Junoo Lal a digital pacifier so he doesn't scream and force you to look at him.
Scrolling is not laziness, it is flight. If you're listening to this, I guarantee that is going to haunt you the next time you open your phone.
Definitely.
Okay, we have covered an immense, staggering amount of ground today in this deep dive. Let's try to summarize this sweeping journey. We started by completely redefining the enemy. The ego is not a psychological phase you can outgrow or heal. It's a biological squatter, defined by a fundamental structural sense of incompleteness. We saw how it hacks the innocent biological machinery of the mind and the physical feelings of the body to manufacture fear, suffering, and a false identity out of borrowed scaffolding. We learned the mind-bending truth that the ego's deepest engine is actually love. a desperate seeking for its own dissolution, but it gets distracted by finite desires, creating the agonizing friction of time.
Yep.
And finally, we saw that liberation is not a permanent glowing destination, but a continuous, daily, exhausting practice of honest, ruthless self-catching until the body dies.
And the application of this is immediate. It starts right now. I want to bring this right back to you, the listener. The next time you feel a surge of physical outrage because someone cut you off in traffic, the next time you feel a deep dualistic ache of loneliness at midnight, the next time you feel that magnetic unconscious urge to pick up your phone and endlessly scroll to avoid the silence of your room, I want you to recognize what is actually happening mechanically.
It's not the universe punishing you. It's your ego fighting for its life. It's feeling the threat of its own falseness. And in that exact fraction of a second, you have a choice. You can either give it a new piece of scaffolding, you can give it a new story of victimhood to chew on, or you can just let it sit in the silence, feel the physical contraction in your gut, strip away the narrative and let it dissolve, even if just for a moment.
Just let the squatter realize he doesn't own the house.
Exactly.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, lingering implication born entirely from everything we have unpacked today. If completeness is not a hidden treasure you can find, if there's no inner light, no majestic soul waiting to be uncovered, but simply the absence of the person who is looking, what happens if you completely stop trying to improve yourself right now? If there is nothing to fix and only your false narrative to drop, who are you in the exact moment you stop defending your story? Thanks for taking the deep dive with us. We'll see you next time.